This is roughly, I know Frederick gave you the numbers on delegated acts and technical standards. We've probably done a little bit of sort of grouping of them here, but also the way that we sort of structured our advice. So even though there are 6 parts to the first mandate, there's 5 on the screen, and equally we're working on 6 regulatory technical standards, and again we have grouped 2 of them there together. It's just the way that we've decided to group them internally. But I won't spend any time on that, as I think we've mentioned them, and I'll go through some of them in a little bit of detail. That's roughly the overall timeline. So we've launched the consultation last week. It's open until the end of September, 12 weeks, thereabouts. The goal is to take on board the responses to the consultation and provide advice to the Commission in Q1 of next year. If everybody loves our advice, we'll probably provide the advice in January. If we get a lot of responses to the consultation and there's a little bit more work to do, then it may be March, but in any event, it'll be in Q1. We'll consult on RTS then from December this year through mid-March, and then a second consultation towards the middle of next year. So just in terms of the actual CPs that, I don't know what I'm pointing at. Okay. Maybe I'll, okay, there we go. So just in a way of explaining the consultation papers that we produced last week, for presentational purposes, we've split the consultation papers into 3. 400 pages in one would have been a rather challenging read, but also we were of the view that there's probably specific aspects of the consultation that are of interest to specific market participants. Obviously, the EU growth prospectus that Frederick has mentioned is of particular interest to a certain demographic and a certain type of issuer, so we decided to concentrate that in a single paper. Similarly, for scrutiny and approval, probably some of it is of more interest to NCAs maybe than to the market, and that was probably one of the more challenging ones to get over the line. And then thirdly, we have the largest paper on scrutiny, or on format and content. Okay, I'm going to have this problem all day. The consultation paper on format and content, so we've split it into format and then content. Content is then further split into the existing schedules, revision of those, followed by the universal registration document, and then the secondary issuance schedule. So in terms of format, we've largely maintained the existing format provisions regarding the order of information to be disclosed. We've had a Q&A for a couple of years on the ability to include a cover note, so we've introduced the cover note into that order of information. It just saves sort of arguments with an NCA, or it's a little bit more transparent to say, look, you can have this. It's very much market practice. But at the same time, we've put certain caveats around what can go in that cover note, because I think there was a growing tendency to have the cover note as a quasi-summary, but also to have it full of or significantly supplanted by legal disclaimers. So that's not something that we think should be the opening for a prospectus. We've also actually introduced in the base prospectus for retail issuance a section on how to use the base prospectus. So we may provide more guidance on that in the future, but base prospectuses often come in for criticism on the basis of comprehensibility. And so therefore we think that particularly where you have a multi-product based prospectus, it's useful to give the readers guidance as to what sections of that they should read, or how they should approach the base prospectus. I know in certain countries that is a bit of a market practice at the moment, and it's been seen as an aid to comprehensibility. So we've proposed including that in the consultation paper. While not strictly in the mandate itself, the consultation paper also contains some proposals in terms of carrying over some of the operative provisions that are in the current level 2. We think that's important. I'm not sure if they're arguably even in the Commission's mandate, but if you don't have that, then it's going to be very difficult to make the schedules work. So in terms of the content schedules, so as asked for by the Commission, the starting point is the existing schedules. In each of the schedules, or in each of the sections, we have a narrative of the proposed changes. Then we summarise the changes in terms of the key changes, and then we have a markup of the existing templates. So what we've tried to do is, I think it's fair to say that a lot of the current regime, despite some of the commentary, a lot of the current regime works quite well. And so what we have tried to do is take what works quite well and then look at some sort of targeted alleviations in terms of the disclosure requirements to reduce the cost and burden on issuers. For example, as Frederick mentioned, the the report by independent auditors or accountants on profit forecasts. To a certain extent, I think we had a lot of discussion on that. I gave a rather similar presentation at 8 o'clock this morning in Paris to a group of auditors, and I think they were of the view that actually they were rather shocked by this proposal, and they thought that it added a lot of value, which is probably not universally shared, but I think it's an interesting thing to look at, and I think we look forward to seeing the responses on that point, particularly as regards cost-benefit for when we put together the final advice. It's fair to say as well, though, while there's an element of deregulation to what we're looking at in level 2 and trying to remove some of the more onerous requirements, there are some additional requirements in there too. And I'd say that those are in there for a readability perspective. So, for example, in the context of equity, we have suggested that issuers should disclose their strategy and challenges. We think that this is important for investors to be able to understand this in a more clear and focused way. Again, it's probably something that was provided by issuers anyway, but I think it's important to be transparent about what regulators are expecting. And we've also changed some of the requirements in respect of derivatives. We felt that, by and large, just having the name and the ISIN of a reference entity was probably not sufficient in most circumstances, and therefore we've made some proposals in that regard. Those will also sort of go towards levelling the playing field between whether you had sort of derivatives based on what was Annex 13 or derivatives in the asset-backed space, where there was quite a difference in disclosure between the two. In terms of the mandate as well, we've also tried to align it with other regulations where possible. So Frederick mentioned the OFR. That's something that we've tried to take on board as well. We've tried to align some of the terminology with the audit regulation, the audit directive. We've had some sort of commentary that perhaps some of the terminology that was used in the existing regime was not particularly accountancy or audit friendly. We've tried to do something similar with AIFMD. What I'd say is that the changes by and large are to the registration document annexes, as this is where we saw the most room for alleviation, particularly taking into account publicly available information. Throughout all of the annexes, we have included a statement regarding the scope of the NCA's approval. While again, this may have been common in certain jurisdictions, we felt it was important for investors not to confuse approval of the prospectus with approval of the securities. So that's probably something that's a little bit new. Frederick's also mentioned the URD. We've based it on the share registration document, together with the inclusion of the transparency responsibility statement and a course reference list, so essentially allowing issuers to meet their TD publication requirements. And then finally, in the content and format, we talk about the secondary issuance regime, where we've tried to reduce the disclosure provided by issuers. Again, this was something that was attempted in 2012, probably didn't work fantastically well, but hopefully the requirements this time around are a little bit more proportionate. I would say that to a certain extent, and this isn't a criticism, but I think a lot of the key policy decisions were taken at level 1, so the extent to which we had a completely free hand at level 2, I think it's fair to say that we didn't, and that certain of the key choices in terms of what should go in, whether it be the SME prospectus or the secondary issuance prospectus, those decisions were taken by the co-legislators. So, sorry, I know I'm running through this very quickly. I have about 2 or 3 minutes.
You have 2 minutes.
Okay, I have 2 minutes. Just on the growth prospectus, the question was asked, well, is it different to 2012? I would say yes. I would say that we've gone from a bottom-up approach this time rather than sort of cutting the edges off the full regime. I would say also that we have looked around at sort of best practice in this area. We've looked at some of the junior markets in Scandinavia, in France, in the UK, in Spain. We've looked at what works well and what the disclosure requirements for those markets are. And we've also taken into account the fact that there are certain disclosure requirements or certain provisions around SME growth markets and disclosure requirements that issuers on those will have. So hopefully it's an improvement on what was there in 2012. I think in calibrating that, we've tried to take on board the needs and the capabilities of SME and the cost of preparing a prospectus. So certain of the more expensive items, perhaps like the OFR, have been removed. Again, a level 1 choice, but something that's reflected in our technical advice. And then finally, on the scrutiny and approval, on approval procedures, they're largely the same as what we produced for Omnibus 2, so I won't really go into that. But on the approval procedures, we had a year-long discussion on trying to get agreement on what should be the criteria, how granular those should be. But I think from our perspective, reviewing a prospectus is a qualitative process. And even if you have two people from the same authority reviewing a prospectus, even with the greatest will in the world, you might have slightly different comments. So I think it's something that's rather unavoidable. Scrutiny is often seen as a sort of a checklist process. We'd like to think that it's significantly more than that, and that there is a reading between the lines by prospectus readers. And it's quite hard to codify that in hard legislation. So we think that there needs to be a level of flexibility there in the scrutiny and approval process. So we have proposed standard criteria for the 3 Cs. We've also, though, given NCAs the ability to go beyond that in the interest of investor protection. We think it's very important to do so. In this scenario, one size definitely doesn't fit all, whether it be redrafts, whether it be product type, whether it be the experience of readers, the experience of NCAs. There are a lot of variables to take into account. And while we can do some of this approval or scrutiny in level 2, ESMA also does a lot at level 3. We have ongoing exchange of information. We have supervisory briefings which we provide to NCAs. So I think that what you will see in the legislation is not all of the convergence work that is happening or that happens as regards NCA processes. So I think I'll leave it at that, and